You know where I left me. You reintroduced me to your love, and you picked up all my pieces. You put me back together. You are the defender of my heart. And when I thought I lost me, you knew where I left me. You reintroduced me to your love, and you picked up all my pieces. You put me back together. You are the defender of my heart. And when I thought I lost me, you knew where I left me. You reintroduced me to your love, and you picked up all my pieces, put me back together. You are the defender of my heart. And hallelujah, you have saved me. So much better your way, so much better. Hallelujah, great defender. It's so much better this way. Oh, hallelujah, you have saved me. So much better your way. Hallelujah, great defender. So much better your way. And when I thought I lost me, you knew where I left me. You reintroduced me to your love, and you picked up all my pieces. You put me back together. You are the defender of my heart.
What's up, Res Life students, and welcome back to our study on the Gospel of Mark. Have you ever looked at something and not seen what was really there? There's a phenomenon in the world of art where this happens all the time. Artists embed a 3D image inside a 2D picture. The 3D image is there, but you can't really see it at first glance. It's called a stereogram. Here's an example. Ever seen this? You can often find them in museums or art stores. Sometimes there will be a little sign at the bottom telling you what exactly you should be looking for, but other times there's no sign, you just gotta figure it out. What happens here is when someone is presented with an image like this, it's that your eyes might look at different points of the image. But that's because it's a repeating pattern. The brain is tricked into thinking that the two spots are the same thing. The brain then perceives depth, with the 2 points as being on the virtual plane behind the pattern. I know, it's kind of cool, kind of crazy, kind of complicated. But sometimes we can't even see the image. Even when multiple people are gathered together looking at the same thing, we can't always figure it out. And as I was thinking about this, I realized there is so much in the world that we cannot see, or just choose not to see. Especially in a social media-driven world, we have the choice to pick and choose what it is we see on a daily basis. And a faith question Jesus asks us is, do you see me? Do you see me is what Jesus asks us every single day. At first glance, when you look at Jesus, you don't always see that Jesus is there. A relationship with Jesus, it's like a walk. You have to keep walking with a person in order to figure things out and kind of what's going on around you. And if you don't examine them long enough, And if you don't stare at them in a different way, or you don't have people around you, you might have a limited view. And if we pick and choose what it is we want to see, we'll have an altered view of what that thing is. So a question I ask you today is, how are you choosing to see Jesus? How are you choosing to see Jesus? And in the Gospel of Mark, chapters 6 through 9, we see a lot of the incredible things that Jesus does. Jesus walks on water. He heals a demon. He gives sight to the blind. He gives hearing to the deaf. He challenges religious hypocrisy, and you see Jesus as this ultimate prophet. In Mark 8, 1 through 21, we hear for the second time a story about how Jesus fed a large crowd of people and did a miracle. This group of people had been following Jesus for 3 days, listening to him teach, and during that time frame, they ran out of food. And Jesus turns to his disciples, and these are the things that we hear in that passage. In verse 1, it says, "In those days when there was again a great crowd without anything to eat, Jesus, he called out to his disciples and said to them, 'I have compassion for the crowd, because they have been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance.' His disciples replied, 'How can we feed these people with bread here in the desert?' And so he asked them, 'Well, how many loaves do you have?' And they said 7. And then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute. And they distributed them to the crowd. They had also a few small fish, and after blessing them, he ordered that these too should be distributed." Let's pause for a second. Jesus tells his disciples to feed the crowd. Again, this isn't the first time Jesus was with a crowd that needed food. He had already done that once. But the disciples must have been preoccupied with other things on their mind, because they said, "How are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness?" They were not putting their trust in what Jesus could do. The story goes on to say in verse 8, "They ate and were filled, and they took up the broken pieces that were left over, 7 baskets full. Now there were about 4,000 people, and he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples, and he went through the district of Dalmanutha." So what just happened in this scene? The disciples saw people who needed to be sent away, but Jesus saw people who needed to be fed. The disciples saw an impossibility, but Jesus saw an opportunity. Jesus was asking his disciples, "Do you see it? Do you see me for who I really am?" But the disciples were struggling to recognize the power of Jesus. I always think that Jesus had a knack for always seeing people for who they truly were and always meeting them where they were at. We see this all over the Gospels. When people were hungry, Jesus gives them food. When people were ignored, Jesus talks to them. When people needed healing, Jesus healed them. Jesus was consistently opening doors for people. But in this story, it's the disciples who are ignoring the message of Jesus, meeting people where they're at. You know, not long after this memorable event of Jesus multiplying food, Jesus was in the boat again with the disciples, and they forgot to bring food in the boat. So the story continues one more time in Mark 8:14, and it says, "The disciples had forgotten to bring any bread, and they had only 1 loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, 'Watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod.' And they said to one another, 'It is because we have no bread.' And becoming aware of it, Jesus said to them, 'Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive and understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect?' And they said to them, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect?' And they said to him, 7. And then he said to them, 'Do you not yet understand?' there was only one loaf of bread amongst them. And they started arguing, and Jesus overheard it. The disciples just saw Jesus do a crazy miracle. They were witnesses to how Jesus provided for the crowd. He took a little and made more than enough with leftovers. And they are still bothered by what they lacked. Would you think if any group of people wouldn't be worried in their time of not having enough, these disciples would have understood? But the disciples, they act just like us. A lot of us have seen God show up in our lives. Whether God spoke to you something personal at camp or church or retreat, maybe in class or just in quiet time. Or maybe you have seen God show up in your family, maybe in your relationships or your friendships, maybe your job. And yet, often we focus on our lack of whatever it is we're forgetting and not noticing the way we see God actually working in our lives. We have seen God showed up, but we doubt that God will show up in this situation or that thing. Hey, you can fill in the blank for whatever that situation is. We have seen God provide for all types of situations, but yet we still sometimes doubt that Jesus is providing for us right here, right now. Did you catch in the story what Jesus was rebuking the disciples for? They didn't remember that Jesus had provided for their needs. He said, "Are your hearts too hard to take it all in?" In other words, are you still so closed off to me that you aren't recognizing who I am or who I can be to you? Friends, it can be easy to put a pause on recognizing how Jesus is working in our life. But Jesus is this way maker, this miracle worker, this light in the darkness, this Messiah, and a promise keeper. Someone who is always having compassion for our needs. But we'll never get to experience the fullness of Jesus if we choose not to see it. So my challenge again to you today is, how are you choosing to see Jesus? Or how are you allowing Jesus to meet your needs today? It is when we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus that we start to realize what's impossible for humans is possible for God. And there is redemption in spite of our brokenness. There is grace for our failures, and Jesus is always ready to embrace us and have compassion in the midst of pain. Jesus is revealing himself to you, so may you embrace that and see Jesus in the season of Lent.